Good morning and welcome to Strasburg Presbyterian Church in Strasburg, Virginia, and especially to our Abba Sunday School class for the 7th of June, 2020. We're starting a new lesson quarterly this week. This will be lesson number 1, and this quarter's overarching theme is the many faces of wisdom. Now, today's lesson comes from the very first chapter of the book of Proverbs, which, as we know, is a collection mostly of Solomon's Proverbs. We will discuss, first of all, the meaning of wisdom in the first place. Second, we'll explore its roots. We'll define its embodiment, and finally, the way of wisdom. Now, first we want to discover what it is we're talking about when we speak about wisdom. In the first place, as we notice in this chart, wisdom is more than mere knowledge. Now, going back briefly to a study of ancient philosophy, we know that knowledge is categorized, generally speaking, in one of two forms. There is first knowledge that. This is propositional knowledge to which we familiarize our minds so that they'll recognize a certain thing when we think about it again. There is then knowledge how. This might more properly be called skill. An artisan or artist learns this as he develops his technique in performing certain functions. Home tradesmen like carpenters, bricklayers, plumbers, electricians, and roofers, they also learn how to do things. And this kind of knowledge is often in the scripture called wisdom. Now, were you to look through ancient philosophers and even down to modern days, you'll find many different definitions of wisdom, all of which agree in the essentials. This is my own definition here: the ability, or that is the capacity, to deploy one's knowledge so to choose and secure the best end as to employ the most suitable means available in the most harmonious and efficient manner possible. That's a mouthful. But what it means is to use what we've learned, the knowledge that we possess, in choosing, in the first place, what the best end is among several alternatives. Excuse me. And then in the second place, to analyze the end that we wish to secure and select a means or the means. Sometimes there are more than one, but this is seldom the case. The best means that is available to accomplish the end that we've selected, and to do so in a manner that's most harmonious and agreeable to the end itself. Now, we see here that true wisdom is not native to the human breast. Now, we are all born with a certain amount of knowledge. John Locke, the famous British empiricist philosopher, once claimed that when human beings are born, they come into the world with a blank slate. I think that's not true. We are born with the capacity to understand certain things as soon as we meet with them for the first time. You'll notice that when Adam was first created, he was immediately able to converse with God. Now, who taught him how to talk? Well, it was part of his native constitution. And I think the early 50s, linguists discovered such a thing as a kind of grammar that's deep seated in our mind, our soul, and that there is a grammar that's common to all human beings, but that in the growth process expresses itself in different languages and so on. The point being that human beings are not born with a blank slate. We have what the philosophers call a certain degree of a priori knowledge, that is, before the fact. Wisdom requires often, we find, the infusion of specialized knowledge. Now, we're going to talk momentarily about two gentlemen named Bezalel and Aholias. You remember from studying the books of Moses that these were two Israelites who were granted what the Bible calls wisdom to construct the tabernacle in all its intricate details, all the needlework, all the metal smithing, especially gold and silver smithing that had to go on, and even the woodworking that went into making that fabulous structure was given to these two gentlemen. Only the pattern, the general pattern, was given by Moses. It was left to these two and others who were gifted with the skill in doing such things. We read that Moses' replacement. When Moses died, he was replaced by Joshua, and the Old Testament tells us that Joshua was given wisdom, that is, leadership skills, to lead the people of Israel to occupy and possess the land of Canaan. Now, we're going to talk this quarter, the entire quarter, in fact, about wisdom literature in the Bible. Now, this term wisdom literature is a specialized jargon invented by theologians to talk about what really is pretty common. We know that there are certain books of the Bible that have almost all are devoted to the topic of wisdom of various sorts. For example, the wisdom literature in the Old Testament includes, most notably, the book of Proverbs. It includes also the book of Job. Interestingly enough, the Psalms is sandwiched between these two books, Job's before and Proverbs afterwards. Ecclesiastes is also usually included among the wisdom literature because it was believed that the same person wrote both the Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, some scholars will also include other books, for example, the Psalms as wisdom literature, but Psalms is actually more like worship literature than wisdom literature. The same with the Song of Solomon's or the Song of Songs, as it is in Protestant Bibles. In the Catholic Bibles, it's called the Canticles, which is the Latin word for song. But that too is more worship literature than it is wisdom literature. And finally, there's Ruth, which, like the Song of Songs, is more like romantic literature than wisdom literature. And of course, we have the book of Esther, which is a famous epic about a queen of the Persian king who rescued Israel from destruction. As for myself, I think the only three books that are actually a part of wisdom literature are these: Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. But we also have wisdom literature in the New Testament, most notably in the Gospels, especially in Matthew's Gospel. the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of which contain what's called the Sermon on the Mount, which is full of the same sort of material that you find in the Old Testament books of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. But then especially the general epistles, that is the Pauline epistles and the epistles of John and Peter, but most notably the epistle of James is full of thoughts concerning wisdom that's given to Christian people. Now here's a chart that's included with this quarter's lesson material. I'm not sure what the purpose of this is, but it seems to suggest that we are awash in an ocean of various experiences and bits of knowledge. Some people are filled with wickedness. We read in Leviticus 19:29. Some in Genesis 6:11 are filled with violence. In fact, this is the prelude to the story of Noah. And the claim is made that all human beings, the whole earth is full of violence. Then we read the spirit of wisdom in Deuteronomy chapter 34 rather. This is where in this chapter we find the description of the actual construction of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And so with all these other things, I presume. Now, the lesson quarterly mentions the commencement season. In normal times, most high schools would have held their commencement either, and colleges too, by the way, would have held their commencement either late in May or early in June. And at this time, all those who are graduating from the school would have been honored by the presentation of diplomas and the giving of speeches and so on. And this occasion symbolized their entrance into adulthood. True, high school graduates aren't legally adults yet, but they may as well be. For example, some can enter into the military service, and I think that could be accounted an adult activity, whether we're legally adults or not. But the fact is, the graduation ceremony symbolizes our commencement into, or let's call it matriculation into life. We begin to build for ourselves our own future, and this is all symbolized by the act of graduation. And it's at this time, the commencement season, that we remember, especially the wisdom literature that we're going to be learning about this quarter, and especially the speeches that we find Solomon delivering to his son. Now, let's look at the context. We're going to begin with the book of Proverbs, although according to the lesson quarterly, as I read the list, a lot of these lessons are going to be coming out of the New Testament. The first unit, that is the month of June, we're going to be studying out of Proverbs. The second quarter, the second month, we're going to be reading out of the gospel accounts. And finally, in the third month, we'll be studying mostly the book of James. Well, now, who was the author of the Bible? Well, in the very first part of the book, we're told that King Solomon was responsible for most of these. So let's talk about King Solomon. By the way, the name Solomon means peace. And the book itself uses a combination of poetry, parables, so-called pithy questions, short stories. We today would probably call those vignettes, and wise maxims in the form of what is called aphorisms, that is, short, wise sayings. usually in the form of a single pair of statements that are almost always, at least in Proverbs, listed or given as parallel statements. There's an awful lot of poetic parallelism in wisdom literature. And I might add very little narrative. It's almost all poetry, kind of like the book of Psalms, but it's poetry with a purpose. That is a specially designated purpose. Now, Solomon was, we know, the second child of Queen Bathsheba. We're all familiar with the story of David's dalliance with this woman. She was at one time married to one of David's own soldiers. And after his dalliance with this woman, he was instrumental in leading to her husband's murder. Yet still, despite all that, he was called a friend of God. Now, the child that was conceived as a result of that adulterous relationship, we know, died. And Solomon was born, that is Bathsheba's second child. And the name sometimes suggests peace, like the word shalom, or the second half of the word Jerusalem, which means the city of peace. But there are some scholars who suggest that the word can also mean, from analogies in Arabic and other Semitic languages, compensation. The idea being that whereas Bathsheba's first child died as a result of her sin, her and David's sin, the second child was given to her as compensation for the loss of the first. Now, early on, after Solomon became king at the death of his father David, there is a biblical story that talks about him as a young man, that is, very early in his kingship. God offered him whatever he wished. He was God's favorite at that time. But David, after considering all the things he might want, decided to request at God's hand wisdom. Not wealth or fame or riches or anything like that, or great treasures, but wisdom, so that he could properly judge the people of Israel. In response to this humble wish, God granted him not only wisdom, but all the other things that kings would have wanted to possess to go along with that. We know that he became an extremely wealthy person, mainly because under his father David, all the surrounding nations had been reduced to vassalage and were paying tribute to Israel every year. This was a tremendous source of tax revenue, but over a period of Solomon's reign, some 40 years or so, these neighboring nations began to break away. That is, they rebelled against Jerusalem. Consequently, the tax revenue from that source decreased, and Solomon was reduced to increasing the taxes among his own populace. Well, this led to serious trouble after he died, and in fact, it was the one thing that led to the dissolution of United Israel and its separation into two nations, the 10 northern tribes and the two southern tribes of Judah. God says to Solomon at the time he gave him wisdom, he says, because it was in your heart, and you have not asked riches or wealth or honor or the life of your enemies, nor have you asked long life, but have asked wisdom and knowledge for yourself, that you may judge my people over whom I have made you king. Wisdom and knowledge are granted to you, and I will give you riches and wealth and honor such as none of the kings have had who were before you, not even David, nor shall any after you have the like. This is in 2 Chronicles, the very first chapter. Now, the name Solomon is the name his mother Bathsheba gave him, but Nathan the prophet uh, told David that the son's name was to be Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. However, he comes down to us by the name of Solomon, and we'll stick with that name, though his initial name is full of special import because God indeed did love Solomon. It's unfortunate that as he advanced in age, he began to depart. One of the first things he did was to marry the daughter of one of Egypt's pharaohs, and as a result, some of that is, the Egyptian religious rites were introduced into the worship of God, that is, at least into Solomon's family worship. And as time went on, his wisdom began to recede more and more. Matter of fact, this is evidenced partly by the fact that he had, so the Old Testament tells us, 300 wives and 700 concubines. That is, during his later years, or perhaps not all at once, but over that whole period, he had access to 1,000 women. Now, as a result, he began losing his mind, that is, losing his wisdom, as I imagine anybody else would with that many women to deal with. Now, the book of Proverbs is full of what we nowadays call sage advice. That word sage means wise, and there are certain derivatives of the word. Sagacity is wisdom, and a sagacious person is one who possesses sagacity. From first to last, Proverbs is full of such sagacious reasoning. Now, although Solomon was the principal author of these books, several others are mentioned, particularly Agur and Lemuel, in the very last chapters of the book of Proverbs. We're told that these two people collected certain proverbs and put them in the collection, and also that Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, after the northern kingdom had disappeared and the southern kingdom was in its last decades, he too, during his religious revival, found and edited an additional collection of proverbs and included them in this larger collection. Now, who it is that was responsible for writing this collection of wisdom statements is really a question that's a matter, for the most part, of guesswork. We can guess who the author was, but we know that from first to last, every word of this book is a part of the inerring oracles of God, and therefore are profitable as we read in the New Testament for discipline, for reproof, from correction, instruction in righteousness, and so on. We don't really care who wrote the book. It may, in some cases, our knowledge of the author will help us to understand the message. But if we depend on knowing who the author of the various books of the Bible are to help us interpret, then we are in a very sad state. The Word of God is just that. It's a collection of words. And the only way to properly understand words is to learn their meaning, both individually and in conjunction with one another, when they're strung out in statements, questions, narrative, and so forth. Now, the structure of the book. The first 7, well, actually almost 10 verses is an introductory statement that gives us a clue not only as to who wrote this collection of Proverbs, but also his reason for doing so, and what, in very general terms, are the purpose of the collection. Then we have the rest of chapter 1, and all through the first 8 chapters, we have a series of separate proverbial paragraphs, let's call them, directed to his own son, that is, to youth generally, but in particular to his own son. Then we have what are called the Proverbs of Solomon, which occupy chapters 10 through 24. Then from 25 through 29 inclusive, we have the collection that Hezekiah brought together. And then finally, in the last 2 chapters, we have the Proverbs of Agur and Lemuel. Now, the question here asks us, what theme do the following phrases have in common? In over my head. This is a vision of a person who has jumped into the water that's too deep for him and he can't swim. He's in over his head. He's in for some serious trouble. Out of my element. Can't get my head around it. This is a particularly graphic description. I try to picture in my mind somebody wrapping his head around any concept. It's a little ludicrous. Coming up short. This reminds me of both the Hebrew and Greek words for sin, and Greek hamartia. These words originally meant falling short. That is, when a person draws an arrow, the bow, and releases it and misses the target, he has sinned. Well, likewise, when we aim at righteous activity and miss the mark, we too have sinned. Just treading water. This is like a person who jumps in the pool or into the water, and he's just splashing around trying to stay afloat, when his first consideration should be to arriving someplace. He should be headed in some direction in order to get out of the water. That is, he needs to find dry land. Not up to the task. This describes a person who is unprepared. The theme of all of these statements appears to be a feeling of being inadequate or incompetent, or in some cases just simply not being prepared for what's come your way. Now, this is a personal question. Was there ever a time in your life when you felt incompetent? I think we can all answer yes to this. I've been in that situation many a time. In fact, practically every time I try to prepare one of these Sunday school lessons, I feel incompetent. They take more work than they should because in my advanced age, I've forgotten an awful lot that I once knew. We all have times when we feel unqualified, unprepared, or incompetent to address a certain task. Sometimes the only way to gain the required competence is just to jump in and do it. I've been working with computers most of my life, learning new programs. There was a time when you bought a program that came with a nice thick manual. But I found that those manuals often didn't meet my needs. And finally, I just got to where, for the most part, I ignored the manual and learned the programs, or at least learned what I wanted to do with the programs by a process of trial and error. And this is how we learn a great many things in life, particularly specialized trades. For example, auto mechanics. I got tired of mechanics ripping me off and not doing good work, that I decided to do my own bad work and became a shade tree mechanic. Well, it took me several years to learn how to do things, and there are certain things I felt incompetent to do and just didn't try. For example, I would never have attempted to open up an automatic transmission. Forget it. How do we overcome these feelings? That is, these feelings of unpreparedness and so on. Let's find out, and the way we'll do that is to study the Proverbs, wisdom literature in the Bible, and currently in the Old Testament. Now, here's the very first verse of the book of Proverbs. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. What are the purpose of these proverbs? Well, the next 3 verses tell us. First, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight. Now, you'll notice here, verse 2, and in fact, all 3 of these verses, 2, 3, and 4, are divided into 2 clauses. The first one and the second one, which more or less repeats the thought included in the first half, but using slightly different words. This is what is known as synonymous parallelism. That is, where the second term is pretty much synonymous with the first, or at least uses words that are synonymous with certain words in the first clause. So one of the purposes is to gain wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight. Now, I think it interesting here, the word wisdom Well, I'm trying to find there it is. I couldn't find my cursor. This word wisdom is the first word in this pair in the first clause, but its parallel is not understanding, but insight. So the first term in this clause is the parallel of the second term in this clause, whereas instruction is the first or the second term in the first clause, and its parallel is the first term in the second. This is what is known as alternating synonymous parallelism. Eat that one if you can. For receiving instruction in prudent behavior. This word prudent is a word that we don't hear much of nowadays, but it's almost a perfect synonym for wisdom. Prudentia is a Latin word, whereas wisdom is an Anglo-Saxon word. And I'm told, and I think it's an accurate saying, that when you're composing an essay, a book, or whatever, and you have a choice between Latinate or a Greek term on the one hand, or an Anglo-Saxon term on the other, go for the Anglo-Saxon term. They're usually more direct, and the resulting prose is almost always more forceful than prose that's full of Latin and Greek terms. So wisdom is for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right. This is the foundation of righteousness. Doing what's just. We read, for example, in Genesis 6 that Noah was a just man. That is, he was upright. And this word fair. Now, frankly, this word fair ought to be eliminated from English vocabulary because there is no such thing as fairness. Fair is in the eyes of the beholder. What's fair to you is not going to be fair to me, and so on and so forth. Whereas what's right is right, and what's just is just. But what's fair can be almost anything. I would prefer that we stick to the first two words, righteousness and justice. And actually, we can do without this word just because it's another one of those Latin terms, whereas this word right is an Anglo-Saxon term. For giving prudence to those who are simple. Now, this simple means those people whose minds are not full of sophisticated ideas. It doesn't mean that they're stupid. It simply means that their minds have not been exercised in the use of intelligence. When we give prudence to the minds of the simple, they learn how to exercise their intelligence to break apart the difficulties or analyze the difficulties they're involved in order to discern a proper way to solve that dilemma. Knowledge and discretion to the young are also included. Now, let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance for understanding proverbs and parables and the sayings of riddles of the wise. Now, all of these are a description of what the process of learning wisdom is all about. What type of promotional blurb would you write on the back of a book about Proverbs? This is, if you were to purchase almost any book, usually on the back of the what they call the dust jacket is a description of the book by various authorities. And so the Sunday school people are asking you to think about what promotional blurb you would put on the back of a book about Proverbs. What would you say about the author? Well, this collection of wisdom was written by Solomon, the son of David, who is said to be the wisest man who ever lived. What will the reader gain by exploring the book of Proverbs? This is the kind of thing you have to consider when you write these blurbs. This book is a must-read for everyone seeking to live a successful life. Now, you notice I've colored this word successful. I don't know that success is that important or ought to be that important to human beings. It is, however, because we're all, to one degree or another, led by our own, to seek our own pleasure, our own satisfaction in life. Rather than successful, I think I would substitute the word righteous. This is a must-read for everyone seeking to live a righteous, and let's even call it a satisfied life. This wise king offers information everyone needs, including how to treat others fairly, and includes helpful tips for making sound decisions in all sorts of different situations. What steps can we take to ensure that we not only hear but also apply with God's wisdom? And how would these steps that we take differ, if at all, when we interact with fellow believers as opposed to when we react to unbelievers? We should immerse ourselves, first of all, in God's wisdom as in all of God's word, by which I mean that we should read it often. Every day we should spend, I don't know, let's say 20 to 30 minutes a day reading God's word. not necessarily with the intention of memorizing it, but simply with the intention of letting it soak into our soul. Only then will we be allowed to make wise decisions, truly wise, and only then will we be able to determine what advice is best for believers and what for unbelievers. Although I would suspect that since truth is truth, that's a tautology, that the advice would be the same for either. In what ways should our church's concern for justice be apparent? Well, one of the things I hear most often from non-churchgoers and unbelievers is the fact that they don't become Christians because, in their view, Christians are hypocritical. Well, this is true enough. There are quite a few of those in the church, or quite a few of us, let's say. We need to be aware of how others perceive our actions, and to be truthful, we ought simply to practice what we preach. Now, notice here, this is the foundation of all wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. You'll notice this word fear. Quite a few commentators say that God really doesn't mean that we should fear him. He means we should simply treat him with respect. Don't believe it. The word fear means fear. In fact, Jesus himself said, you shouldn't be afraid of the man who can kill your body. You should rather fear the person who can send both your body and soul to hell. That, my friends, is fear. If we conduct, actually, love is a better motivator than fear. But when I was raising my children, I was more concerned not whether or not they loved me, but first of all, whether they feared me. After the right kind of fear was instilled in them, then they can begin to love me. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. This word here, mother's teaching, this word in Hebrew is actually Torah, which means the law. The meaning of that word Torah is literally, as you see it here, teaching. So the father's instruction and the mother's Torah, her teaching, we should listen to the one and never forsake the other. They are a garland to your head and a chain to adorn your neck. This word garland is like a plaited wreath that's put on as like a crown on people's heads, either for decorative purposes, especially on occasions where they're receiving a special honor. Now we get into the meat of today's lesson. My son, it reads here, if sinful men entice you, do not give in to them. And after this, the Sunday school material skips the next 9 verses altogether and goes on to other matters. Frankly, I think that's a mistake, and I'll attempt to show you why. Here's the rest of the story. My son, notice the green and the red. If sinners entice thee, this is from the King James Version. If sinners entice thee, consent thou not. If they say, come with us, let us lay wait for blood. Let us lurk privily for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them up alive as the grave, and whole as those who go down into the pits. We shall find all precious substance. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in thy lot among us. Let us all have one purpose. My son, this is again the word of the father instead of his friends. My son, walk not thou in the way with them. Refrain thy foot from their paths, for their feet run to evil and make haste to shed blood. Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird, and they lay wait for their own blood. They lurk privily for their own lives. Now, so are the ways of everyone that is greedy of gain, which taketh away the life of the owners thereof. Now, if verse 10 were looked at by itself without verses 11 through 19, you'd think that this was a very general or generic description telling us, hey, look, avoid bad people. But that isn't the point. By not including these 9 verses that follow, we're losing the specificity of this request of the Father to his Son. To illustrate the point, I'll resort to a brief parable. Imagine a young teenager, let's say he's 15 years old, and a name is not important, but let's call him Johnny. Johnny's an intelligent kid. He always makes good grades in school, either A's or B's constantly. Not only that, but he's a good athlete in all the major sports in his high school: football, basketball, baseball. And he has, so the coaches say, an excellent chance of earning a college scholarship. But Johnny has one problem. He has some friends who are not quite so savory. There are 4 or 5 of them. Doesn't make any difference the number, but they are all given to mischief in one way or another. Some of them even to acts of minor vandalism and so forth. And one day the leader of this group suggests that they try something new and exciting. Let's rob a liquor store. That way we can get drunk and have an awful lot of revelry. So they drive Johnny's car, actually his father's car he borrowed, that Johnny borrowed from his dad. And they drive into the parking lot of a liquor store. Johnny's left inside behind the driver's wheel so they can make a quick escape, and the other 3 enter. Well, during the robbery, the storekeeper reaches under the cash register and pulls out a gun and shoots one of the 3 teenage robbers dead. In response, a second teenager, in this case the leader of the pack, draws his own weapon and shoots the store owner dead. And then the 2 remaining teenagers run out, jump in the car, and holler at Johnny to get the you-know-what out of there. Johnny heard the shots, and he knows what's happened. And in a few days after the police catch up with him, he realizes his fate. Even though he was not the one that pulled the trigger, under the laws in most states, he is just as responsible for the murder of that store owner as the teenager who actually pulled the trigger. His likely end, because they'll almost certainly try him as an adult, is that he will spend the rest of his natural-born life in jail. His life will turn from bad to worse. And all because perhaps his father had failed to say to him, "My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not." Out in the open, wisdom calls aloud. She raises her voice in the public square on top of the wall. The wall that surrounds the city is almost always a rampart where the guards or the lookouts stand. She raises her voice in the public square. On top of the wall, she cries out. At the city gate, she makes her speech. How long will you who are simple love your simple ways? How long will mockers delight in mockery and fools hate knowledge? For the waywardness of the simple will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me will live in safety and be at ease without fear or harm. How would you describe the basic point of the book of Proverbs? Basically, I think just reading this part of the book, I'd say the foremost lesson is stay out of trouble and be careful. who you choose as friends. Be discriminatory. Discriminate between good and evil. Solomon teaches that there is a right way and a wrong way to live. He does indeed. Reverence for God and his words is the starting point for everything worth knowing. This, I think, is a truism that goes without saying. Without reverence, that is fear of the Lord, you'll never gain words of wisdom to live your life by. The choices you make will almost always be bad. And even when you make choices or think you're making choices that further God's purpose or that are good in his sight, be careful. All your righteousnesses are as filthy rags. Parental advice is praised and peer pressure is discounted. Here's a note especially for fathers. Your children, sooner or later, are going to have to learn about the fatherhood of God. If not, they will have serious troubles in their lives. The first way they have of learning the facts necessary about God's fatherhood is watching their own father. As fathers, you can teach your children about God's fatherhood by acting righteously toward your kids, by disciplining them when they need it, and loving them always. How did the instructions in the book of Proverbs differ from advice from other sources? Well, mainly they're derived from God. They are words of God through Solomon to us, by which we ought to order our lives. Other sources, that is, other forms of literature, entice a reader with cynicism or promises that one way is no better than the other. This is what we call relative ethics. Relativism is a poison. Proverbs is different because there are no contradiction in any of the pieces of advice, aphorisms given in Proverbs. It is always positive. Solomon assures the reader that knowledge based in the fear of the Lord will lead to a godly life, while following the crowd, especially the wrong crowd, is a path to failure and woe. What's one step you need to take to be more fully submitted to God? This is a phrase you'll hear from me often. Immerse yourself in his word. What should a teacher of children do when realizing that a child's instruction received from a parent is unbiblical? We have two examples given down here at the bottom. Exodus 20, which is part of the Ten Commandments, and says children should honor their parents. The same is repeated in Ephesians 6, but only the first three verses are referenced here. Whereas later in this same chapter, it says not only should children obey God, but their parents should do all they can not to instill hatred or disrespect in their children. How would they do that? Well, for one thing, by acting in ways other than they want their children to act. Without giving directive advice, I love this. How would you use Proverbs to support a fellow believer who is beset with anxiety? What they're asking here is, how would you counsel somebody who is beset with anxiety, whether over his sin or financial affairs or whatever? But this counsel is directive advice. In other words, you're directing somebody how they should handle the situation. We need always to heed warnings, and especially those that we find in God's Word. The thought to remember, You should read Romans 2:18 through 24, which is a catalog of forms of behavior that evil men almost everywhere will sooner or later become involved in. Those claiming to be Christians but who do not live accordingly give others an excuse to disbelieve. Remember the cry I said earlier, oh, but they're all hypocrites. Yeah, right. We'll skip the next few of these to this week's thought to remember: fear the Lord and learn wisdom. The value or the subject of next week's lesson material will be value wisdom. Good day.